In the barren mountains of Afghanistan, the air felt like a weight, pressing on the shoulders of the young recruits. They stood in formation, their faces pale from fear and exhaustion. The war was not what they had imagined when they left their homes. The tales of honor and bravery that had filled their minds were quickly replaced by the harsh reality of military life. It was not only the enemy they had to fear, but something far closer and more insidious, the cruel tradition of Dedovshchina. It was a word whispered in dread among the new recruits, a system where the older soldiers treated the younger ones not as brothers in arms, but as servants and victims. The first days were filled with hope. The boys believed they would learn discipline. They would be hardened into soldiers who could withstand the challenges of war. When they were yelled at during drills or ordered to run until their lungs burned, they accepted it as part of becoming strong. They thought the punishments were meant to prepare them for the dangers that lay ahead in the rugged Afghan valleys. But the truth revealed itself in bruises that appeared for no reason, in sleepless nights filled with threats, and in the humiliation that came not from an enemy, but from those who should have been their protectors, the veterans who had already served months or years in the unforgiving desert, carried the scars of both combat and cruelty. They had endured the same cycle of abuse, and instead of breaking it, they chose to pass it on, believing it was tradition. They demanded obedience, not through respect, but through fear. They ordered the recruits to polish their boots until they shone like mirrors, to scrub the floors until their hands bled, to give up their rations when the older soldiers were hungry. The line between training and torment disappeared, and the barracks became another battlefield, one hidden from the world. Among the group of fresh recruits was a boy named Aleksei. He was only 17, still carrying the softness of youth in his face, but his eyes held a stubborn fire. He endured the same punishments as the others, but unlike them, he refused to bow completely. He clenched his fists in silence when struck, and though his body bore the marks of abuse, his spirit resisted. The veterans saw this defiance, and it enraged them. They singled him out, pushing him harder, making his suffering worse than the rest. Yet Aleksei did not break. In the quiet hours of the night, when the others lay trembling in fear, he whispered words of strength. He reminded them they were not slaves, they were soldiers. He told them to hold on to their dignity, even when everything around them tried to strip it away. His voice became a small light in the darkness, giving hope to those who had begun to lose it. The Afghan landscape mirrored their torment, endless stretches of desert dust storms that burned the skin and valleys where shadows hid unseen enemies. But to the young recruits, it was not the enemy's bullets that haunted them the most. It was the footsteps in the night, the cruel laughter of veterans, and the knowledge that danger waited not only outside their camp, but within its very walls. Each day was a battle for survival, not against foreign fighters, but against their own comrades. Some of the recruits began to break under the pressure. Their eyes grew empty, their voices quiet. They did whatever was ordered, hoping submission would shield them from further pain. Others started imitating the cruelty, believing it was the only way to avoid becoming targets themselves. The line between victim and oppressor blurred until no one knew who they truly were anymore. But Aleksei held fast to the memory of his home, to the words of his mother, telling him to stay human. No matter what the world demanded, he carried that memory like a shield, and though he could not stop the cruelty, he refused to let it consume him. His defiance was quiet, but it was powerful. In a place designed to strip them of hope, Aleksei became a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, a spark of resistance could survive. ChatGPT said, "The weeks dragged on, and the days blurred into one another. as the recruits struggled to find meaning in the endless routine of orders, abuse, and fear. For Aleksei, the weight grew heavier, but so did his determination. He had become a symbol for the others, not because he was the strongest or the bravest, but because he refused to surrender his humanity. He did not fight back with fists or anger, but with a quiet resilience that unsettled the veterans. They wanted to break him completely, yet every blow they struck seemed to harden his spirit instead of shattering it. One night, the veterans decided to test him further. They ordered all the recruits outside into the bitter cold, forcing them to stand without coats or gloves. The icy wind bit into their skin. Their teeth chattered and their bodies shook from the freezing air. The older soldiers watched with cruel satisfaction as the youngest began to stumble and cry. Aleksei stood in line, his body trembling like the rest. But when he noticed one of the smallest recruits barely able to stay upright, he stepped forward without hesitation. He pulled off his own coat and placed it on the shivering boy, shielding him from the cold. The act enraged the veterans. They saw it not only as disobedience, but as defiance, a challenge to their authority. They dragged Aleksei away, beating him until his vision blurred and his body collapsed in the dirt. But even as he lay on the ground, gasping for breath, he did not cry out. His silence carried a strength that echoed in the hearts of the other recruits. That night, something changed. The recruits no longer looked at one another with suspicion or fear. Instead, they began to see themselves as brothers, bound not by the cruelty forced upon them, but by the compassion they chose to show. From that moment, small acts of resistance spread through the barracks. The recruits began sharing food instead of giving it all to the veterans. They cleaned together and protected one another from the harshest punishments. When one was beaten, the others stood by him, refusing to let him feel alone. The veterans still held power, but the control they once enjoyed began to slip away. The young soldiers were no longer isolated. They had found strength in unity, and that unity grew out of the example Aleksei had given. The war outside the camp continued to rage. Patrols through Afghan villages, ambushes in rocky valleys, the constant echo of gunfire and explosions reminded them of the real enemy. Yet for the recruits, the true test was not only survival against an unseen opponent, but survival of their souls. Inside the barracks, the desert was merciless, and so were the men who had once been broken and now sought to break others. But now, there was a seed of hope, and it grew each day. Aleksei, though battered and weakened by constant punishment, still whispered words of encouragement at night. His writings on scraps of paper, hidden beneath his mattress, became a secret journal of their struggle. He wrote about the injustice of Dedovshchina, about the pain of being treated as less than human, and about the courage it took to resist quietly. His words spread among the recruits, passed hand to hand like a sacred truth. Each boy who read them felt less alone and more determined to hold on. The veterans noticed the change. They tried to crush it with harsher orders and crueler punishments, but it was too late. The recruits had begun to understand the power of brotherhood. For every bruise they shared, a bond. For every humiliation, they answered with loyalty to one another. Slowly, the fear that had defined them began to shift into something stronger. They could not overthrow the system around them, but within themselves, they created a space where dignity survived. In the harsh Afghan nights, when the stars burned bright above the desert and the wind howled like a warning, the recruits lay awake, not only with fear, but also with a fragile hope. They realized that though the world around them sought to erase their humanity, they could choose to protect it. They could choose compassion over cruelty, loyalty over betrayal, courage over silence, and that choice made them stronger than the cycle of violence that surrounded them. For Aleksei, the pain never ended, but neither did his resolve. He carried the scars on his body, yet, within his heart, he held something untouchable. He had shown that even in the darkest of places, a single act of kindness could spark a fire strong enough to challenge an entire system. That fire now burned quietly within every recruit. A silent rebellion in a land already consumed by war. ChatGPT said the final months in Afghanistan felt like years stretched into eternity. The recruits were no longer the naive boys who had once marched nervously into the camp. Their faces had hardened. Their eyes carried the shadows of both suffering and survival. Yet within that darkness, there remained something unbroken, a thread of humanity that Aleksei had kept alive. Even as the cycle of Dedovshchina continued, its grip had weakened. The veterans still barked orders, still punished those who defied them. But their cruelty no longer carried the same weight, because the recruits had learned to endure together, and that unity was a power the abusers could not control. The war outside the wire continued to demand lives. Patrols ended in ambushes, roads hid mines, and the desert wind carried the cries of battles fought in silence. Yet it was in the quiet of the barracks where the greatest struggle remained. Each night, Aleksei wrote in secret, his words filling scraps of paper with the truth of their hidden war. He wrote not only for himself, but for the others, for the memory of those who had fallen, and for the hope that one day someone would understand what they had endured. His writings became a silent testimony, a reminder that their pain would not vanish into the dust without being heard. One evening, after a long and brutal day, a moment came that none of them would forget. The veterans ordered a cruel punishment, forcing the recruits to stand for hours under the burning sun without food or water. Many began to collapse, their bodies unable to withstand the torment. The veterans laughed, seeing weakness, but Aleksei stepped forward once again. He lifted one of his brothers who had fainted, carrying him back to the shade, refusing to let him be discarded like an object. The act enraged the veterans, and once more they struck him down. But this time, the other recruits did not remain silent. One by one, they moved to shield him, standing together as a wall of resistance. For the first time, the veterans saw fear in their own eyes. It did not end the cycle completely, but it shifted the balance. From that day, the older soldiers realized that cruelty could no longer isolate the recruits. The boys had become men, not through abuse, but through defiance. They learned to find strength in compassion rather than in domination. They chose to protect one another even when the cost was pain, and that choice made them untouchable.